I do think it's incredible how strong and how you've been able to cope, really. And I put that down to your really early years, childhood experience, but also the relationship that you've got. You're amazingly close.
For years, Prince William and Catherine perfected a very specific kind of royal survival. They revealed just enough to remain visible, but never enough to feel exposed. They smiled when expected, appeared when necessary, and kept the most important parts of their lives hidden behind the familiar walls of palace restraint. That silence became part of their identity. It made them seem disciplined, controlled, almost untouchable. But over the last 2 years, something has changed. Not all at once, not with one speech or one confession. It happened in stages, through illness, fear, family scandal, and the quiet collapse of the old royal instinct to never let the public see too much. And what has emerged is a version of William and Catherine that feels less polished, less distant, and in some ways, far more powerful than the image they spent years carefully protecting. The turning point was Catherine's illness. When Kensington Palace first announced in January 2024 that she had undergone abdominal surgery, the language was clinical and limited, exactly what one would expect from a royal household trying to contain both concern and curiosity. There was no emotional framing, no invitation into the reality of what she and the family were experiencing. It was presented as private, managed, and under control. But that controlled silence did not have the effect the palace likely hoped for. Instead, it created a vacuum, and in the modern age, vacuums never stay empty for long. Social media filled the gap. Rumors multiplied. Conspiracy spiraled into spectacle. The absence of information became its own kind of story, and suddenly, the couple's most trusted strategy, privacy through silence, began to work against them. Then came the bench video.
I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding whilst I've been recovering from surgery. It has been an incredibly tough couple of months for our entire family, but I've had a fantastic medical team who have taken great care of me, for which I'm so grateful. In January, I underwent major abdominal surgery in London, and at the time, it was thought that my condition was non-cancerous.
Catherine, seated outdoors, composed but visibly changed, spoke directly to the public in a way the royal family rarely permits itself to do. She did not speak like a figure performing institutional confidence. She spoke like a woman trying to explain pain in the calmest language she could manage. She confirmed she had cancer. She said she was undergoing treatment. She asked for time and space. And in doing so, she broke open something the monarchy usually keeps sealed shut: vulnerability without mediation. The moment landed with unusual force precisely because it did not feel like a palace statement. It felt like a person standing in front of fear and naming it. That moment changed Catherine's image, but it also changed William's. He stepped back. Public duties fell away. Engagements disappeared from the calendar. And for a man who had sometimes been accused, in earlier years, of not carrying enough visible royal weight, the contrast was striking. This time, the absence was not interpreted as weakness or indifference. It was understood as something else entirely: presence at home, presence with his wife, presence with his children. Instead of performing duty in public, he was living it privately. And that distinction seems to have altered the way many people saw him. He was no longer only the future king in waiting. He was a husband in crisis, a father trying to explain terrifying things to children, a man choosing family over optics. That choice mattered. Royal men, historically, have not always been praised for emotional fluency. While many have survived by appearing composed, not intimate. But William began speaking differently. Not constantly and not recklessly, but with enough honesty to signal that the old emotional rules were loosening. When he later spoke about the difficulty of explaining Catherine's diagnosis to George, Charlotte, and Louis, the effect was powerful precisely because it sounded so ordinary. There is no manual, he said in essence, no script for that moment.
Well, the British royals have posed for a new formal photograph. Duchess of Cambridge, Kate Middleton, as it always is.
Yes.
You just can't help but notice her. But take a close look at her tiara.
Yeah.
That's one of Princess Diana's favorites. It's actually the one that she wore.
In another era, that kind of admission might have been considered too personal, too revealing, too human. In this era, it made him feel more real. Catherine's remission announcement in January 2025 deepened that shift rather than ending it. One might have expected the return of the old polished royal rhythm, the graceful re-entry, the carefully controlled reappearance, the suggestion that things were now steadily moving back to normal. But that is not quite what happened. Instead, Catherine continued speaking in ways that sounded noticeably less filtered than before. She talked about recovery not as a neat victory arc, but as something difficult, uneven, and disorienting. She described the phase after treatment as one of the hardest parts, when the world expects recovery to look neat and complete, while the body and mind still feel altered. That is not the kind of language royal women usually use in public. It carries too much truth, too little performance, and perhaps that is exactly why it resonated. There was a visible change in her after that, not only in appearance, but in tone. Catherine seemed quieter, but not weaker, more reflective, but in a way that suggested depth rather than fragility. Her public references to nature, healing, creativity, and a new normal began to feel less like campaign language and more like a woman trying to build meaning out of an experience that had shattered the previous version of her life. Even seemingly small details, such as her choice to avoid alcohol and speak openly about being more conscious of her health, carried symbolic weight. In royal life, tiny departures can reveal entire internal transformations. This was no longer simply the Princess of Wales returning to duty. This was a person who had been changed, and who was no longer trying very hard to hide that change. At the same time, the family around her was changing too. The old royal method had been silence first, statement later, emotion almost never. But the Andrew scandal made that model harder to sustain. For years, William and Catherine had kept a diplomatic distance from it. They did not publicly insert themselves. They did not offer moral commentary. They let the institution absorb the damage in its own way. But by early 2026, that distance had become harder to maintain. The continuing revelations, the scale of public disgust, and the pressure on the monarchy's moral credibility meant that saying nothing no longer looked neutral. It looked evasive, so when they finally commented, cautiously, strategically, but unmistakably, it marked another rupture in the old pattern.
My father's first words on entering Westminster Abbey yesterday were a pledge of service. It was a pledge to continue to serve, because for over 50 years, in every corner of the UK, across the Commonwealth, and around the world.
Their statement of concern, with its emphasis on victims and clear emotional seriousness, did more than address a scandal. It drew a line. It signaled that the future king and queen did not intend to remain permanently shielded by institutional vagueness when a moral issue became too large to ignore. That shift was significant not because they suddenly became outspoken, but because they showed a new willingness to speak when silence threatened to become part of the problem. For William, especially, it reinforced a long-suspected instinct that the monarchy's survival depends less on preserving internal loyalties than on maintaining external trust. And that brings us to the deeper story underneath all of this. William and Catherine are not simply more open now because they feel like it. They are more open because the conditions of royal life have changed. The public no longer accepts blank walls and carefully worded voids the way it once did. Social media punishes mystery. Suspicion grows in silence, and younger audiences, in particular, seem to respond not to grandeur, but to glimpses of real feeling. William and Catherine appear to understand this. Their digital presence, especially from 2025 onward, became noticeably more deliberate, but also more personal. Not oversharing, not chaotic, but humanized. That matters because theirs is perhaps the first royal marriage truly shaped by the logic of the digital age while still carrying the burden of eventual kingship. Earlier, royal couples either belonged to the pre-social era or adapted to it awkwardly. William and Catherine are doing something more subtle. They're trying to maintain monarchy while making it emotionally legible to people who distrust polished distance. That is a difficult balance, and at times, they clearly misjudged it. especially during the early months of Catherine's illness, but once they changed course, they did so with notable clarity. Catherine's videos felt more personal, her posts carried more of her own voice. William's comments about family life sounded less abstract. Even the way they curated what to reveal and what to withhold showed a new kind of strategy, not complete openness, but selective intimacy. Their children remain the clearest example of that balance. George, Charlotte, and Louis are still heavily protected, but not invisibly so. For years, they existed almost entirely within controlled windows. Christmas walks, balcony appearances, carefully timed school photos. That pattern largely continues, yet there are signs of a gradual shift. What especially with George growing older and inching closer to the age when the monarchy inevitably begins pressing the future onto a child. Public glimpses have been slightly more meaningful, more intentional. Not enough to expose him, but enough to begin normalizing his presence. Charlotte, too, has appeared in ways that suggest both parents understand the public appetite for authenticity and the need to let these children seem like themselves, not just symbols in waiting. What makes this transition especially compelling is that it is happening alongside a visible strengthening of William and Catherine's partnership. Their marriage was once sold to the public as a modern fairy tale. Handsome prince, beautiful commoner, careful courtship, perfect wedding. That version always felt too neat, too externally constructed. What has emerged in the wake of illness feels much less glossy and therefore much more convincing. They do not look like a couple performing idealized romance. They look like two people who have been tested and chosen each other again under pressure. That difference is everything. When Catherine was ill, William did not simply stand beside her at set-piece moments. By all accounts, he reorganized his life around the family. School runs, hospital visits, emotional steadiness, domestic presence, the kind of things that do not make for grand royal imagery, but do reveal character. And Catherine, in turn, did not emerge from illness speaking only as a patient or princess. She spoke as someone who had been held up by family, creativity, and private resilience. That mutuality has changed how people read them. They no longer seem like a couple protected by royal polish. They seem like a couple who survived something difficult together and are now less interested in pretending life can be packaged neatly again. That shift may also explain why they feel more central than ever to the future of the institution. They are not waiting passively for the crown. Their work increasingly suggests preparation, infrastructure, and long-term intent. The Royal Foundation, Earthshot, early childhood development, homelessness, mental health, environmental work. This is not ornamental philanthropy. It is architecture. They are building a model of future monarchy, grounded not only in symbolism, but in visible usefulness. And their growing public candor strengthens that model rather than weakening it. In an age where inherited authority alone no longer guarantees emotional legitimacy, sincerity becomes part of statecraft. Still, the transformation is not total. William and Catherine have not become confessional celebrities, nor are they likely to. Their instinct for privacy remains strong. They are still cautious, still controlled, still deeply aware of the risks of overexposure, but they are no longer relying on distance in the same way they once did. They seem to have learned something the palace was slower to understand. If you say absolutely nothing, the world will invent its own version of your truth. Better sometimes to open the door just enough and let people see the person inside. And maybe that is the biggest change of all. For years, the public was invited to admire William and Catherine. Now increasingly, they are invited to understand them, not fully, not without boundaries, but enough to see the outlines of something more complicated and more compelling than the old royal script allowed. Catherine is no longer merely the impeccably composed princess. She is a woman who went through illness, emerged altered, and speaks about recovery with unusual honesty. William is no longer merely the disciplined heir. He is a man who, when faced with family crisis, chose intimacy over public performance and discovered that doing so made him stronger, not smaller. That is why the silence feels different now. It is no longer a wall. It is more like a choice, one they still use, but no longer worship. They know when to close the door And now, increasingly, they know when opening it serves them better. The result is a royal couple who feel both more vulnerable and more authoritative, more relatable and more prepared. That combination is rare, and for a monarchy that has often struggled to appear emotionally credible without losing its mystique, it may be exactly what the future requires. So perhaps the real revelation is not that William and Catherine have suddenly become radically open. It is that hardship forced them to stop performing only the old version of themselves. Illness stripped away polish. Scandal demanded moral clarity. Parenthood made emotional distance impossible. And somewhere inside all of that, a more truthful public identity began to emerge. Not perfect, not careless, but real enough to change everything. Because sometimes the most powerful transformation in royal life is not a change in title. It is the moment people stop looking like symbols and start sounding like human beings. And once that happens, there is no easy way back to the old silence.